Okay. Welcome, Saj, to the podcast. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Anders. Happy to be back. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was thinking we had a very enlivening discussion last time, and I was thinking we just kind of jump in to maybe more technical
Mm,
questions. Again, it might kind of spontaneously turn into something else, but my first question that I wanted to kind of jump into and parse through is, we talked about trauma last time. And I think we were talking mostly around complex or early childhood, early developmental trauma. And I was thinking it could be helpful to parse a little bit what the differences are between complex trauma and maybe more adult onset, big T trauma, like event
yeah.
trauma, if you have any insights on that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question to start with. I mean, I'd say there's a couple of key differences here. The biggest one being that, you know, you're not going through major developmental milestones and developmental windows that are very sensitive to forming who you are as a person when you have an adult trauma, and when you have something happen to you when you're, 20 years old, it could be really intense and it could shake you to your core. It could be very traumatic. But the thing that it probably will not do is fundamentally, it's less likely, I should say, to fundamentally alter your personality. Your personality, your core programming, your core sense of the world is already formed at that point. Now, contrast that to what we would call complex PTSD, complex trauma, which I think the definition of that is that A, it happens early in life, it typically happens in a person's family of origin, and it's repeated, right? So it's not necessarily the big T trauma by which we mean like, the big car accident, the assault, where, you can really point at something. These are the more pernicious little T traumas, which is to say that they're things that are happening every day, that are very, that we adapt to. And because, we'll still have the same nervous system responses, such as dissociation, because they're still very threatening things that are going on, even though they're, normalized in a sense in the environment. But again, the big difference is that you have an entire consciousness, an entire personality that is being formed inside of the trauma bubble at this point. So I guess another way of saying that is, let's say, somebody's in a state of dissociation in response to the trauma, and they are forming as a human being, as a personality, they are forming inside of dissociation versus,
Mhm.
that's not what's going on when you have a trauma happen to you when you're 20 years old.
Okay, so that's really rich. I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to form inside of dissociation.
Uh, well, what it's, I guess another, again, a more concrete maybe way to relate to is just, if imagine forming inside of a a heroin experience that's lasting years and years,
Mm.
and all of who you are, that incredibly vibrant life energy that children have to be in the world, that's forming inside of this protective psychobiological response of blankness, of nothingness,
Mhm.
of emptiness. So, I think, yeah, let's go to the basics of it, right? So if we're talking about trauma, we're talking about, varying levels of activation and hyperarousal and hypoarousal. So, like panic symptoms, as well as stress. I mean, I'm sorry, as well as dissociation.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
hallmark, I think, of really what's going on, if you're going through things like insecure attachment, which I would say is a very common form of trauma that happens to people, that's really kind of happening inside of dissociation, meaning, we're going to a very numbed out place inside of ourselves. And part of that numbing response could be a way that the organism defends against relationship. Because if you think about if relationship is the place where threat is coming from, then kind of the blanking out, the numbing response is going to blank out our need for relationship, our attachment needs, our bonding needs. And so you're going to get a person that develops without that as part of their structure.
Mm.
And from what I've seen, I mean, this can look a lot of different ways, but one way it can
Mhm.
look is just, a sense that like a really core sense that there really aren't other people in the world. It's almost like a narcissistic bubble that can form, and you're the only thing inside of that bubble because obviously it's not true, but it's true to a psyche that had to use that kind of separation from relationship to be safe.
Mm.
I feel like maybe
Yeah.
I went in a lot of different directions with that, but
No.
uh,
You're answering it, and I imagine I kind of asked it like not jokingly, very seriously, but very much realizing how hard it is to describe because we're
yeah.
talking about inner phenomenological
Mhm.
realities, psychic realities that don't always translate to words. So I think maybe trying to describe it, you have to live a life, to describe it, or maybe we kind of circumambulate the topic a bit. But I think the idea that you're just describing about this, like this sort of life energy, this maybe leaning in towards a live reality, present moment, um, just being here. Um, there's something about that we lose contact with it, with dissociation. It's almost like dissociation. To the degree we dissociate, it's the degree we're out of contact with. Um, I don't exactly know what to say. Reality, with our own inner experience, with the experience of otherness, and it sounds like when that happens in a developmental, in a context of childhood, let's say, or infancy, going upwards, um, certain points along a developmental trajectory are dissociated from. It's not that they don't happen, but they happen in a dissociated way within a dissociated
Yeah.
bubble. So there's still a sort of as if development. People still become adults and still form entire lives and have functioning lives, have maybe a family, but something has been dissociated off that's vitally important to the essence of that person, of their uh, ability to be fully present with others, fully intimate, fully alive.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're nailing it. There is an as if life that happens. You're right. Development does take place, but it's taking place inside of that trauma bubble, and it's kind of in I would say, a contactless reality in which it's taking place. So people are growing. You're hitting your physical milestones. You're hitting all other things, but I would say it's almost like learning to paint by numbers. Like you're not
Mm.
living life from this
Wow.
direct intuitive place of, you're in contact with your own being, your own self, your own soul, but you're like looking outside of you and saying, oh, well, this is how it's done, I guess. These are the rules. These are and so that's what I mean by paint by numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's so true. And I think that so kind of going back to the difference between big T and little T trauma. So with little T trauma, yeah, it's almost like you're developing within a sort of dissociated cocoon, and the work of is to sort of maybe not get rid of that cocoon, but to be able to start experiencing life not so confined within that dissociated cocoon, become more into your own intuitive, personal, unique aliveness,
yeah.
your own unique imprint in this world. Um, and as you do that, the cocoon starts to kind of the structural dissociation starts to kind of fade away.
Yeah.
You know, not necessarily get rid of dissociation, because that's just a mechanism that is part of being human, but just the structural aspect of it, the aspect of it that is more of a cocoon. It's kept you in a stasis,
Yeah.
starts to kind of fade and not be so reified, and you start to actually be able to spontaneously be that imprint that you are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, uh, I think something that bears, I think we're both touching on it to some degree, but I'll just speak it, which is to say, when you're in that dissociative cocoon, you're not getting new information about the world. You're not actually, I mean, again, the human mind is incredibly complex, yeah? So you're growing up, you're developing sort of, adult cognitive functions. Those things are working okay, right? But there is still a very significant part of who you are, part of your childhood that's living in that cocoon, that
Mm.
that lives in a very, very different reality. It it's a very different world that you're living in. And the thing is that because it's normal for you, you won't notice it. You don't notice. You assume that how you're experiencing the world is how everybody else experiences the world. Because again, it's this very inner, complex phenomenon that's hard to bring awareness to, I think, without medicines. Um, but but yeah, you're not getting contact there. You're not getting new information there. You're not
Mm.
sort of
Mhm.
you're not you're not integrated from that place.
Mhm. Yeah, and I like what you're saying about you're not getting new information.
Mhm.
You have a lot of because it seems that there's a lot of predictions about the world, and you're
Mhm.
seeing a lot of the predictions.
Yeah.
And sometimes those predictions, again, they can be really handy and useful when you look out into the dark, and maybe you've got a campfire, you're looking out at the dark and you're seeing shadows, and well, I
Yeah.
think that shadow means this, and maybe that shadow is dangerous.
Mhm.
But if you really had a light that you could bring a torch out to you're like, okay, that's just like maybe it's a leaf kind of swaying back and forth. Whereas in the dissociative cocoon, you're kind of just living in the places where that shadow moving is dangerous.
Mhm.
And you're not able to actually really be present with and take in new information about the world and yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. The pathways for new experiences, new information is not built out in your system. And so I think first of all, when you were describing, I'm like, oh, we're heading into Plato's cave here. But, but, uh,
Yeah.
no, but, um, but I think what we are touching on is a phenomenon that happens that we've sort of discerned in the world of memory reconsolidation research, which is to say that, we have these long-term memories that have undergone memory consolidation, which is a neurological biochemical lockdown process of the synapses and the proteins that are part of memory. And we used to think that these long-term memories were really not subject to change. But that's not true. What the research is telling us is
Mm.
that there is, a couple of two key factors have to be present for long-term memories to be moved back into what's called a labile state that allows them to undergo alteration. One is, you need access to whatever is in that memory. So meaning that if something is living in dissociation, if an event, if aspects of self and childhood are living in dissociation, you need to pull them out and feel the content, the texture of that world. The other important thing that needs to be happening is what's called a prediction error. And I think this is what you're touching on here, Anders, which is to say that, there needs to be a discrepancy between your internal model of reality and what's happening around you. And insofar as you're in a lockdown, numbed out cocoon, it's very hard for you to realize that, wow, the world today is different than the world that created the cocoon.
Mm. So there needs to be a sort of experience of the texture of the memory itself, like maybe the sensory elements, the smells, the faces, maybe the narrative to
Yeah,
some degree.
if you have explicit access to the memory, great, but you don't need just explicit access to the memory. You can have implicit access to the memory, and that's why I was saying, when we're talking about childhood, mostly that's implicit memories that we have. The
Mhm.
sense of something, the texture of something. You're not going to have a narrative around,
I see.
your attachment, for example. But yeah, go ahead.
And when you said prediction error, so something about your prediction is in discrepancy with the reality of what's happening, and there's an awareness of the discrepancy,
Yeah,
and that allows for being able to change and alter how we remember and how we
yeah.
okay.
Exactly, because once those two things are present, again, this is memory reconsolidation theory. Once those two features are present, then the brain says, wait a minute, there's something really unique happening. This is different than what I expected to happen. And so it pulls those long-term memories out of long-term memory and it moves them into short-term memory. And of course, when it does that, it feels like it's here now, it's happening to you now. And because of that, and oftentimes the things that we're talking about are traumatic in nature, it's going to be destabilizing for a person when their mind pulls these well tucked away, compartmentalized long-term memories back into what's called a labile state. But the good news, it's really good news that we can do that. And then when it packs that memory back into long-term, it it, it undergoes, again, the same neurochemical lockdown mechanism that originally happened. But the big difference is now this new experience, whatever it was, whatever created the prediction error, is now part of that long-term memory. So for an example of this is for somebody to say, I have a lot of neglect and abandonment in childhood, and they fully expect all of their relationships to fail, and uh, and let's say they something happened in their childhood when they were 2 years old. That's when really the family fell apart, and the contact and the support and the attachment really started, fell apart at that point. And so as an adult, they get 2 years into an intimate relationship, and bam, their
Yeah.
system is recreating the same thing over and over again, reenacting the scene of the crime, as I would call it. And and let's say, you're this person's therapist, and you know that from their history that, 2 years into any intimate connection, human connection, they blow it up. Yeah. And even their therapeutic relationships, they blow it up. And so you, as a good therapist, are going to say, okay, this client is going to try and blow up this relationship. What day is it? They're going to try and blow it up, and then this client becomes a pain in the ass, right? Because again, they're not doing it purposefully or consciously, but their system is saying, let's reenact the scene of the crime here. And so they're going to be doing everything they can to sabotage that therapeutic relationship with you. They're going to show up late. They're going to call you late. They're going to test you in all
Hmm.
sorts of ways, looking for you to say, I'm done, right?
Hmm.
But but again, you being a good therapist, you say, okay, I'm not doing that, and
Hmm.
then you hold your seat and say, I'm just going to outlast this period of this. And at some point, that client's brain says, wait a minute, I'm not being fired. This relationship is not being blown up, and so
Yeah.
that would be the prediction error.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. And I see it all the time in my own practice, but also in my own sessions of
Yeah.
the feeling like, oh my God, the bad thing is happening, or uh, I can tell in the moment, I don't know, but once there's this sort of awareness of body sensations, just the present moment reality, it's almost like a part of me is kind of looking out, and I'm here. It's just this moment of like something in the body, the nervous system is just like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
What is this? This is completely new.
Yeah. This is
And
different.
it's it feels just like completely potent, completely alive. uh, really mysterious place that my mind enters.
Something's getting into the dissociative cocoon. It's new
Yeah.
information. It's a new experience of reality that's somehow making its way into that cocoon. And it feels, I think you're giving voice to, kind of the disorientation and what it can feel like to be like, wait a minute, this is not what I expected.
Yeah, and I've seen in some PSIP videos of talking about dysregulation, and kind of having, our ordinary, kind of our dissociated sort of self, kind of apparently normal self, kind of going about the day, the as if self, and then, or as if life, right? There's the whole patterns and organizations of how we relate to others, ourselves, kind of going, and then the old material kind of coming up through the depths, so to speak, and overwhelming the sort
Yeah.
of business as usual
Mhm.
self. And that I'm calling that dysregulation. And that process seems to be inevitable. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on maybe ways to do that safely. And
Uh-huh.
I know it's hard to summarize in just,
Yeah.
5 minutes or 30 seconds, but
Yeah.
um,
You
yeah, how to
mean,
do that safely without completely blowing up, uh, what life somebody has built,
yeah.
so to
Yeah.
speak. Yeah.
I think, I mean, so I think the first premise of what we're talking about here is this idea that dysregulation is necessary for healing to take place. It's not a bad thing to be dysregulated. Prediction errors will dysregulate. Moving some piece of your scene of the crime or your nightmare back into, short-term memory will feel dysregulating. Um, and so just to sort of, I think, initially change our relationship with what dysregulation, thinking about it, first of all, it's not a bad thing. It's a necessary part of therapy. And then the only question is, can we do it in ways that, can we set up, the structure of therapy such that, the actual therapeutic processing will be dysregulating, and then life outside of that therapeutic processing will do other things that'll be stabilizing. It'll be, you have the right resources on board, you have the right support groups on board to really kind of balance that out. So, yeah, I mean, I will say that, I mean, I think another way of describing all this is to say that psychedelics are inherently prediction error generating machines. You know, that's why they're so great. That's why we love them, because something so incredibly unique and surprising is happening that we couldn't even conceive of. And our sense of the world is different. And what we're doing in the PSIP model is taking that prediction error generating quality of psychedelics and saying, great, let's use that in the human realm, in the relational realm, to say, let's generate prediction errors about human relationship, because that's the vast majority of where our complex trauma comes from, is human relationships. And so, so this is, I know that's kind of a side piece, but this is all to say that, all of that is going to be destabilizing for people. Psychedelics inherently are destabilizing. If they're not, that's fine too. Then you're having a nice journey. Then you're having sort of this pleasant kind of recreational kind of experience. But because I mean, remember, even the world being utterly beautiful will be destabilizing for people. It's not just like that, raising the nightmare, but sometimes seeing how good the world is or how good people are, how the fact that people are really there, for example, will also be destabilizing. So again, it's not a bad thing that destabilization is happening.
Yeah, I'm curious, if you want to share, or do you have any kind of maybe anecdotal insights from what you've seen, what people go through during this sort of dysregulation, maybe the peak of dysregulation phase, what life looks like from the inside, maybe also from the outside?
It can look in so many different ways. I mean, there's so many variables that create what dysregulation will look like and how anybody will go into it. Um, you know, the variables that affect it are, how old were you when, what's being worked in your system? Is it
Mm.
something that happened when you were 20 years old? It'll be still, there might be some dysregulation to that, and it'll be intense in some ways. But it's not going to be anything like if you're sort of restructuring an entire personality that got formed in that cocoon that we're talking about. That will be much more dysregulating. Disorientation, you don't know what's up and what's down. You don't know what version of reality is actually real for a bit. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I'm having so many thoughts in response to that. And I think maybe to ground myself a little bit is just going back to the original question
Mm.
and like looking at what does treatment look like for these two
Oh,
types of traumas. But it sounds like, so with complex trauma and the way that you could work with it is, I like the memory reconsolidation literature. That seems really helpful. And something I see in other, non-medicine therapies, I don't know what the actual term is for this, but a lot of them work within, the window of tolerance, which this is certainly not working within.
yeah.
Um, for anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's just kind of working within, within this kind of nervous system. I don't know if it's an arbitrary marker or where they've marked, okay, we're at, this is hyper arousal, this is too far aroused in the nervous system, and then hypoarousal, so too much deactivation, where therapeutic work, it's almost like, maybe it can't really go those directions. So you need to keep people within this certain sort of regulated
Mhm.
um, bandwidth for therapeutic work to really be successful. And this is just not how you do work at PSIP.
Yeah.
You could certainly talk about that if you want to. I think you've talked quite a bit about window of tolerance, but
Um,
what I wanted to actually specifically talk about is, in the literature, there's a lot of talk about like action sequences. So this is common in certain somatic therapies that get stuck
yeah.
in trauma. So maybe we could just specifically, we could focus on adult onset trauma if we think about like
Sure.
a sexual assault
Mhm.
and a therapist having a pillow in front of the client and the client pushing, right, and
Yeah.
doing the action sequence that got stuck. And it seems like there's a mixture of top down and bottom up processes happening, but I would say seems to really more hang on in the top down, in the secondary consciousness versus the primary consciousness.
Yeah.
Um, there's something about it that's a little bit more manufactured. Again, it's still, I think you can do really good work in that way, but this is just a lot different than what you see in PSIP, where there's a lot of bottom up. There's a lot of primary consciousness. I'm not, the pushing isn't happening because my mind is thinking I didn't get to push. It's happening more out of like the body is just doing the movement, and you might not even know it's pushing.
Yeah.
It's almost like a roller. You're kind of on a roller coaster. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that. There's no really question in that, but it's something I've been thinking about and trying to, because I don't work with medicine, and so I've been wanting to try to bring in some of the spirit of
Mhm.
of being able to have primary consciousness, the signal kind of on board,
Yeah.
um, without medicine. And I think it's challenging. I don't think it's impossible, but it's certainly challenging.
Yeah, yeah, I did 13 years of my private practice without working with medicine, and so you can get there to varying degrees, but that's it, right? You're there to varying degrees, and having medicine on board just helps a lot more for, and I'm assuming in this conversation people know what we're talking about, the difference between primary consciousness and secondary consciousness, but maybe we need to touch on that. But
Mm.
yeah, I'd say in the pushing example that you gave, the real question is who is doing the orchestration of that? Who's putting that together, that movement pattern together? Is it truly your primitive, primary consciousness, non-declarative aspects of your mind and memory, which we're going for that in PSIP, because as we know from Van der Kolk lays this out very very well, that your secondary consciousness, your conscious mind ability to sort of take in and record information while in a highly stressful or traumatic state is really significantly degraded. We're just kind of making things up. We're filling in the blanks a lot of times. That memory system really kind of goes offline. What's very much online is the primary consciousness recording systems. The brain networks that make up primary consciousness are recording everything. And we can tell that because, I mean, you see people move into infantile processes at times in PSIP, and there's no secondary consciousness on board at that point developmentally at all, right? So it's really just sort of an infant nervous system reaching out towards mom's face and making contact and things like that. So I would say, the more we can have all of this process be coming from primary consciousness, the better it is. Because when it's not, we're telling stories, we're guessing. Like just because you have an impulse to push, against a pillow that a therapist is holding, it doesn't mean that that's what was actually going on. Like you might just feel activation.
Yeah.
You might feel like tight muscles, and your brain is interpreting that as like, oh, I must want to push, so let me push. And so I think, what if that's not what actually is the action impulse that was recorded at way back here? What if the actual impulse was, to maybe try to push, but then do something else, and we just don't know. We just don't know what it is. So
Yeah, I think what you're touching on right now is what comes up in my mind a lot. Is you can kind of bring in this sort of solution work, right? I think this is a term I've heard you use before, is like the kind of mix, the balance between solution and kind of nightmare, which we could talk about a little bit, but yeah, maybe we should talk about it before I go into my. Yeah, if you want, could you maybe just a little bit about solution and nightmare?
Yeah. So again, in most somatic modalities, they use what you brought up, Anders, which is the window of tolerance model, right? So keep somebody within a moderate range in terms of their nervous system, not too panicky, not too activated, and not too depressed and dissociative for therapeutic work to be useful. Unfortunately, trauma does not live in the moderate zones. Trauma lives in the extremes of activation. Trauma lives in the extremes of dissociation. And so, and the other thing that we see with psychedelic work is, somebody will take, a medicine, and like very shortly after that, their systems will be like in processing in those extremes. Like organically, they're moving well beyond the window of tolerance. And so what we're doing in the PSIP world is saying, okay, let's re-envision this. It's not so much about regulation and tolerance, because there's clearly lots of biological things that we undergo that are well outside of the window of tolerance, like giving birth, for example, is well outside of anybody's ordinary consciousness window of tolerance, and yet it's something incredibly organic. It's an altered state of consciousness, and we can do it. Our bodies can do it. And so what we're doing, that's kind of like a model for how we like envision the PSIP model. We're letting go of regulation and window of tolerance, but instead of that, we're working with relationship, and most importantly, solutions. So essentially, you're adding solutions to the trauma such that the nervous system says, wait a minute, there really is a way out here. And I'll put it this way. When your nervous system is dissociating as a response to trauma, you're enacting a solution. You're not there. And so, but it's a very heavy price. It's our ultimate solution in a way, and we pay an incredibly heavy price for the kind of safety that trauma dissociation cocoon gives us. And so how we're working with that in the PSIP model is saying, let's pull forth the scene of the crime instead of letting it live back here in dissociation. Let's pull it to the foreground so you can see it and smell it and feel it, and it's sitting in your lap. And in addition to that, let's add in all sorts of wonderful relational, warm mammalian solutions that the person didn't have when this was going on. And I promise you that a person's system will, and I'm basing this on millions of years of evolution, that we are designed to head into relationship as a solution rather than to head into dissociation as a solution. If we can, right? If relationship, if, solid, helpful, supportive, competent relationship is there, we will head into that instead of heading into dissociation.
Beautiful. Wow. And I think that's so with that in mind, kind of going back to what we were saying with bringing, there's a way that this top-down sort of, it's assuming the solution, right? It's assuming that the solution was to push, and so let's have you push or something, and it might actually be cathartic.
Yeah.
But sometimes the push really didn't happen, and there's something even maybe deeper.
That's it. Yeah.
Like the push would have happened a long time ago. There's no chance for that. And now maybe it's just like, I need to have a finger that, just comes up or something.
Yeah.
We really don't know. And I think that's the mystery of this work, is we really don't know. We can't come in and say, this is what is needed.
Mm-hmm.
And we might actually be halting some of the nightmare that does need to be approached with solution. You're just skipping over. Yeah,
you're nailing it, Anders. Right. So look at it this way: that many of our students, for example, when they're processing, or clients, they much rather prefer empowered states. Right? They much rather prefer their ego. Their top-down ego will say, like, oh no, of course I want to push and get this away from me, or something like that, right? But what may need to actually be processed, the action sequence that may need to be processed here, is that the pushing didn't work at all. And so when you add relational solutions to that system, then what you're helping them do is go to a deeper version of collapse, where they might be living much more in collapse. And so if you're going to make contact with the part of their being that lives in that collapse, that's where you have to go. You can't override it. You can't have them cathartically push out of collapse.
Yeah.
You have to say, like, so in other words, people need support in order to finally go to let themselves collapse, or let themselves, be powerless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then that kind of comes to my next question. How do you provide solution in this relational container where somebody is living out a relational nightmare? And how do you as a facilitator both facilitate the movement into this nightmarish place and also be a source of solution and being with?
Yeah, no, it's you're nailing like a key aspect of the PSIP model, which is we're always doing this balancing act between these two forces. The two sort of things that we're looking to do is, support. We build a container in which a client system is not managing and escaping, or distracting and avoiding and coping, so that the nightmare can finally begin to emerge, right? So we're doing that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're doing solution work with them, And so this is the art form that is psychedelic therapy. This is the art form that is the PSIP model, which is to say, let's, in one breath, you can do things that are further pressurizing the client to into the nightmare, and in the next breath you can do something that really adds much more like that relational connection into it, you know. But yeah, that's exactly. So let me give you an example of this. Like, so in PSIP, I think one of the things that people are very surprised about is just the level of attunement that's like constantly running in the session. You know, so if you're sitting there and your eyebrow goes up, your PSIP therapist will ask you about it. They'll be like, "Oh, what happened there?" You know, and so even in the case where somebody is, you know, in the middle of I'm going to give you the most extreme case possible here, right? So even in the case where somebody is having negative transference towards their therapist, you know, they're thinking that their therapist is their perpetrator parent, and so their therapist is angry with them, is judging them, or is going to like even physically hurt them or something like that. So that's the nightmare that's coming out and being expressed, right? And in this case, it's being expressed relationally. And the fact that the PSIP therapist is still like finely attuned to that reality of, you know, how scared the client is of them, and they're seeing it, they're noticing every little detail about it. That is a solution piece, right? That is a prediction error. Because again, guess what was not present when that nightmare was actually taking place? Attunement. Attunement was not present when that was taking place. So yeah.
Oh yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and I'm sure we could just go on and on about all sorts of examples and configurations of where, but okay, so this is actually taking me to, and I do want to touch on adult trauma, but it's much more alive for me right now. So this is kind of going into the transference and childhood realities.
Yeah.
So especially when we're working with complex PTSD, and I mean, I would imagine even with adult onset, it's not like there is such a thing as a non-traumatic childhood. So of course, this will probably always play a part in working with a human being, some form of trauma from development. But so something that I think about quite a bit is engaging with childhood reality. You know, you're not speaking to the adult, so to speak. You're speaking to a child who is scared that they're going to die, or is scared that you're going to leave them. You're not going to be with me forever. I need you with me forever. And actually talking to that one, and saying something that is not literally true, but is needed for that childhood reality to be met. And I would say that's a solution move. However, you know, and I've both been the receiving end of that, and I've been the giver, so to speak, of that. I can see how someone could see that and say, but you're lying. You're saying, you know, in 2 hours, they're going to be away and you're not going to be protecting them. And they actually could be in danger. You know, we can't really know what's going to happen to them when they leave the room. Do you have any thoughts on that? That's something that I think sometimes, but at the same time, I also think it's needed. So, yeah.
I would say that if you think therapy is about the truth, you know, I'd say throw out this idea of the truth when you're doing therapy. First of all, you have no access to what the truth is. You have access to what the truth is as it lives in your client's system. That's all we're really concerned about. You know, and the client thinks that they're like working with truth and non-truth, and they want to really know what happened and things like that. But the essence of it is we're working with what is inside and living in the client's subjective reality. Yeah. And so I think the thing that you described is like, you know, we're moving away from sort of, if the client is asking, you know, will you always be there for me? You know, and like imagine like a 4-year-old is asking that question, right? Of course, the truth is no, right? But you don't have to say, there's no reason to say that truth to a 4-year-old. And there's no reason to. So, in other words, I would propose that what's not being asked here is not reality-based questions, but security-based questions or solution-based questions.
Mm.
And and if the ultimate goal of therapy is that you want your client to sort of, come out of these sort of traumatic realities and things that are going on there, then, you're going to be working with, again, that very subjective state rather than sort of,
Mm.
objective things in the world. I think that's inherently what we're doing in psychedelic therapy versus what we're doing in, like reality testing types of modalities. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love your response of dropping truth, dropping truth, not dropping like a truth bomb, but like
Yeah.
dropping the conception of truth
Hmm.
in therapy. Yeah, because yeah, you wouldn't want to. Yeah, if a child is saying like, "Are you going to be able to keep me safe forever?" and you say, "Well, no,
Yeah.
I'm going to
Yeah.
die eventually,"
Yeah.
and yeah, just really horrible, horrible security,
Hmm.
attachment responses to just a young child,
Yeah.
and being sensitive to that when a client or another person is there, because if they're there and you do meet them in that way,
Mhm.
then I think that unlocks
It, yeah.
it unlocks. But if they're not there, and there's something about that maybe could really not ring true.
Mhm.
But so maybe that just really requires sensitivity on the part of the facilitator, the therapist, to know what is the truth here. What is the truth state? What is the reality that we're in?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. You have to have a sensitivity to the context, to the reality that's being played out here. And again, when you're working without medicine, then you are typically working with multiple, you're working with an adult consciousness, you're working with a kid consciousness. And I think what we're saying even applies in without medicine, but certainly if you're working with medicine and you're pressurizing, you have a container that's really evoking sort of child consciousness and regression to those states, then I think that's the world that you're going to be talking to. That's the reality that you're going to be talking to. Yeah.
You might not know the answer to this, but so regression. When we think about regression, and we talked a bit about this last time. This is not an as if regression. This is a
Yeah.
sort of I am experiencing the world through the eyes of young me, whether that's I'm a baby, I'm 4 years old, I'm maybe an amalgamation of a couple different parts of me from various years. But it's not an as if, it's not a God, I'm like a kid right now with these childhood like emotions. It's you are in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that seems to me to be where the most challenging and shaking to this dissociative cocoon. That's where that work happens, is when
Yeah.
you are regressed in that state, really just in the whole world of that self state, that
Mhm.
regressed state where dissociation happened. And you're living in that world through that version of yourself.
Mhm.
Do you think, I find that without medicine, it's a lot harder. It's almost like the signal, there's more noise.
Mhm.
And so there might be like a phantom of it, and maybe sometimes people can move into it, but so easily that it just fades
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
likely due to dissociative processes. I'm not entirely sure, but do you think it's necessary? Um, is that the right question? Yeah, do you think it's necessary for people like to be really in it, or do you think you can do this work when you're kind of just you got an ear to the door
Uh-huh.
of the regressed self, maybe speak for the regressed self? And does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a black and like a binary thing in that way that you can either do this work or not do this work based on like how regressed you are. I think there's a spectrum with it, meaning that yeah, you can do meaningful work when people have that dual consciousness or that sense of, oh, I'm an adult and I'm speaking as like I can feel these impulses
Hmm.
from this childhood place. I think the depth of healing, the like the sweet spot, the best healing processes that I've ever seen or experienced really happen when the regression is thorough. So in other words, this is going to be a little bit counter to if people know that the IFS world of there's a lot of unblending that tries to happen
Yes.
in IFS world.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
it's the
and
opposite.
unblending is a very a big thing there. And again, I'm not IFS trained, so and I have very limited experience with it. But in the PSIP world, we're fully supporting the blending. We're saying, yes, you
Yeah.
fully go here, and I am going to hold the container for this. So we're not expecting the client to both regress and then hold their own container
Yes.
with an adult consciousness. The therapist is playing the other side of that. Yeah. In
Yeah,
people.
there's this emphasis on sort of like witness consciousness that I think I see in IFS. Again, also not trained, but I've read quite a bit on it, and I think that's what I resonate with what you're saying there, is that I think the witness, I mean, sometimes it's I think it's informed by like a really intelligent movement, or like a really present moment movement, even following how we've been describing signal. Witness can be that, but I think sometimes the witness is also another as if part
Yeah, it really
dissociated
is.
from,
Yeah.
and we could try to hold that part and then say like, I am going to venture down and meet this younger part of me, but that's just also another part of you. That, and this is kind of what you're talking about. It feels very much, it's a movement of, rather than unblending into this witness, whatever that, and it's just more, it's like more fully into the process,
Yeah.
which is a bit much more like getting strapped into a roller coaster and um, kind of thrown, you know, without your and willing, really.
Yeah. No, you're right. Like a lot of times in the PSIP world, we refer to it as like, you know, like, let's see. Like you can be you can have a witness as a passenger in the car, but the car is really not being driven by the witness, and even to the extent of which there really is no witness, because again, I think the correctives, the healing, the I mean, there's no bigger prediction error than an infant that had abandonment finally reaching out and touching the face of a parent, you know, and you don't need to have sort of a kind of witness to do that. You can just be the infant and have that happen. And
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
the healing is in the tissue. It's in
yeah,
the
yeah.
activity of that very alive discovery that takes place there. It's not like an adult doing that.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. Yeah, because where's the room for the witness in that? And unless you just, and you think of witness as just consciousness, like there's just being, but there's no sort of reflective, self-reflective cognition happening.
That's right. That's right. So I know, I think we should, you're going to get a ton of conversation and comments around like, what this whole idea of witness and what it can be, and,
Yeah, yeah,
what
okay.
kind of self-state it is. It's a really kind of big undefined area to go into. One thing I
Hmm.
will say about it is, the way that Robin Carhart Harris, a neuroscientist, describes secondary consciousness is that a feature of secondary consciousness is self-awareness.
Hmm.
So which is to say, when you are that when you're in total flow, when you are that infant reaching for mom, you don't have that self-awareness. You just are this flow, this thing that is doing this, you know? And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's a doing, and there's not a there's not so much a self-reflectiveness on the
Right.
doing itself. There's almost like a purity to the
That's it.
doing.
That's it.
Not to put a moral judgment on it, but yeah, it's just there's a purity to the movement itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and developmentally, during infancy, you didn't have self-awareness that you were doing this. You were just doing it. I mean, that's how it worked back then, you know? And so I think the closer if we have an option to be really close to that experience, let's take it. You know, and again, there's no, I think we can theoretically go back and forth on this, but experientially, I will say that like the deepest healing experiences that I've ever seen or I've ever had are when there's no witness, there's just this being that's in the purity of doing what it's supposed to be doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I resonate with that.
Where do you go from here?
Adult trauma, yeah. No.
Adult trauma. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I did have you know, I do want to check your energy levels, but
Oh yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, I think about development being stunted and a sort of as if development taking its place. And I don't know, I haven't read too much on the neurobiology and the science of how exactly complex trauma affects the brain or cognition. I do know it does in
Yeah.
some ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do wonder about that. And in this process of shaking the dissociative cocoon, so to speak, and your own unique aliveness, you know, coming into this more pure being that you are, and able to actually from that place where there's stuckness in that flow, in that movement, actually start to maybe correct some of the developmental milestones that weren't met. And I wonder about that. Even just I don't expect you to know because it's a lot of it seems just to be anecdotal and like what's working is what's working. But I'm wondering right now, just kind of tentatively, yeah, I wonder if you start to see actual neurobiological changes when that dissociative shell is gone, and people, yeah, it's like maybe before I wasn't even able to approach math because, you know, whatever's wrapped up around math, but now I have this sort of renewed vitality and ability to just pay attention to things that before would have caused this infant to start screaming, or this dysregulation to happen. And now that doesn't take over my awareness, and I have this just open capacity to explore the world and take in new information. And how does that change a brain? I'm interested in that.
Well, I mean, I think there probably is really good research on different aspects of this, but so one thing that just I can cite off the top of my head is, you know, Alan Shore's work, who, if you don't know, Alan Shore is a medical researcher out of UCLA, and he studies right hemispheric brain development in infants based on attachment style, you know, and essentially, you know, one of the things that, you know, this is overly reducing his work, but essentially, you know, you can see that infants that have had sort of this warm mammalian relational calming, that meaning, i.e., they had secure attachment, they had mom or dad that would come in and meet their needs and calm them, and over, you know, this would happen thousands and thousands of times in infancy, and eventually this infant internalizes that self-soothing capacity, right? Because we're not born with self-soothing capacities. We're born with the ability to be activated and call out for help, essentially, but we're not born with the ability to sort of calm things down. Now, contrast that infant with the other infant, which is, like didn't have that warm relational calming effect, where eventually, so there's a lot of rage going on in that system, but eventually that infant will calm, but the calming that happens there is not warm mammalian calming, it's reptilian calming. It's much more primitive dissociation that's going on in that system. And so according to Alan Shore, you can see different brain neurocircuitry become activated under brain scans based on which of these infants that you are. So my imagining would be that if we're able to reverse that with this, meaning if we're able to sort of really bring in much more warm mammalian calming that into an infant system that didn't have that, again, I don't know if this has been researched, but I imagine that we're looking at very different brain circuitry at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that I love that approach. Yeah, we're not born with self-soothing capacities. It's yeah, it's very true. We are born with the attachment cry, with the with the sort of intuitive sense of where to reach for help.
Yep. And again, that's why relationship is the big solution for human beings, right? For social animals. Like our primary go-to was like, let me cry out for you, and if that worked, then I have one particular life, and if that didn't work, I'm going to have a very different life, a very different brain.
Oh.
Yeah.
So
It's huge. It's huge. The the crazy part of this kind of thinking about things this way and the research behind it is that perhaps some of the biggest things that influence the quality of our lives, the direction of our lives, all took place like really in the first 2 years of life, essentially, and if you hit the jackpot, meaning you grew up in a family and you had that kind of parenting where you were given that warm mammalian calming whenever you had a need, that's priceless. There's nothing that can kind of substitute for that. And you're just going to live a life, and to a large extent, life is going to seem easier for you. You're going to be regulated. When you get fired from a job, when a life throws you a curveball, you're going to be like, oh wow, that's awful. I feel a little bad, and you're going to take 3 deep breaths and go for a walk, and you're going to be like, okay, well, let's keep going, right? Versus people who didn't get that. Again, it was no fault of their own, and this happened before the age of 2, and they have no idea why life is so hard for them.
Wow. Right.
They have no idea why. They think like their mind their secondary consciousness will come up with all sorts of narratives and like spiritual narratives and meaning structures and all sorts of things, when it just comes down to this really basic biological thing that they didn't get, and they have to go through to non-relational dissociative calming activities for them to deal with life. They have to numb out.
Yeah. Do you see with this work, people going from that reptilian strategy, from the, they didn't get the calming, they didn't introject the sort of ability to regulate, to people who didn't have that, and then people going from that to being able to self-regulate and actually maybe go more towards that maybe we could just say healthy, secure attachment. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it's possible. Again, I think we're not talking about talk therapy here, right? We're not talking about having more insight that's going to create this pattern. It's a mixture of procedural repetition and habit that helps with that, and it's also like really processing deep levels of trauma. Because remember, for that second infant to just scream out and not get their needs met, Oh, there's a ton of charge going on in that system
Yeah.
underneath the dissociation. So it's not just about that person learning to regulate. It's about that person now having to like really work with the amount of charge that's at such a early level in their system.
Yeah. Can we say a little bit about charge?
Hmm.
I know what I imagine some people when they hear that might think charge. What is
Oh.
charge?
Um, Nervous system reactivity, things that, so I mean, let's just an obvious example. Let's say you're in a car accident or almost just avoided a car accident. Your nervous system is having a huge adrenaline release, a response to that experience,
Mhm.
and so that's like a one-time event that your nervous system is having a response to. If there's if you can imagine going back to a period in your life where you're just completely dependent, like literally you can't even like pick your head up,
Mhm.
and you have no ability to be in your head, you have no ability to manage anything. You're 100% dependent for
Can't
your
think about your
survival.
future, your
Yeah,
taxes.
yeah, you can't, there's no escape here, right? You're just there. And for you to not get your needs met in that state is going to create so much reactivity, so much charge, like fight or flight. I mean, real fear of death is going to be a part of that experience for you. Um, and that charge can look like, like incredible upset. It can look like anxiety. It can look like panic attacks.
Mm.
But what it tends to look like, because it is so overwhelming, is nothingness. It looks like blankness. It looks like, your biology is. This is what I mean when we're saying that there's a reptilian dissociative response. Your nervous system is releasing endogenous opioids to blank you out from the
Mm.
intensity of what's going on here. So all of that are symptoms of charge,
Mm.
um, and also the dissociation in particular is why it's so hard to work with these places, because you can't track it. You can't feel dissociation. You're the way that it works is that it's supposed to be invisible to your mind, versus you can track anger, you can track panic, you can track fear and anxiety. You can't track numbing. So
Yeah.
that's one of the big reasons why it is. I would say dissociation is like a huge linchpin in the entire world of mental health. It's what creates treatment resistance. It's what makes things really difficult to work with. And it's a huge gift of psychedelics that they allow us to engage and work with dissociation much more clearly than you can without them.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
It's such a interesting. I just love this. I love talking about this. Um, there was something on my mind as you were talking. Right before this, we were talking about something. It's now
Charge.
dissociated.
Oh, okay. We were talking about charge and
Charge, and then maybe right before that.
infant charge. We were talking about not you. You asked the question whether it's possible to have that redone. Can we fundamentally redo the
Yes.
mind here so we
Yes.
become much more that self-regulated, like world is a good place infant?
Yes, exactly. And yeah, then we started talking about the charge and what a charge is, and I think too for listeners, I think most people who will be listening to this will kind of intuit this or know this from their firsthand experience. But insight alone, just having the insight of, oh, I was a baby who had an attachment cry that wasn't met, and so I can't really self-regulate. That is not going to be. I mean, I think that it's helpful to know that and to have that be part of your narrative. And if it really is part of your sort of autobiographical understanding of yourself, that's great. But that is not a replacement for the experience of what that would have been like for you, and the
Yeah,
charge there. It's just they're on like a different plane of
they're totally
existence.
different things. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I would say how that reality lives inside of you. You know, I think it's a mistake to say, oh, well, that happened to me 30 years ago, right? That happened to me 50 years ago. That in one reality, it happened to you 30 years ago and 50 years ago,
Yeah.
but in another reality, you
Still
are
happening.
absolutely
Yeah.
living there right now. That's the key. And when
Yeah.
when we go there with medicines, when we go there in that regress state, you can tell people are living there right now because all of that, again, that charge,
Mm.
that dissociation is fully right there for people. You don't even have to like look that hard. It's there.
No, and what you're saying is really interesting. I've even used the word trauma time before. It
Mm.
because it doesn't exist in doesn't seem to exist in linear time, the way we experience it. When there is a trauma and there's traumatic dissociation, the material that gets dissociated doesn't seem to progress. It doesn't seem to exist in a linear fashion or
It lives outside of time. It lives without connections to other aspects of your life. It's context-free information. So we know, for example, one of the hallmarks of PTSD memories is that they didn't go through a hippocampal pathway in the brain. And the hippocampus is the thing that adds chronology, it adds context, it adds meaning, and like it puts an experience in the context of your life. So you can relate to it that way. When things get encoded traumatically, they're going through an amygdala encoding pathway, totally different. But the key thing that you're speaking to here, Anders, is absolutely true. Yeah, the amygdala does not have time. And so there's a eternal timeless quality to these memories. And folks, if you're sitting there and saying like, oh, this is theoretically interesting or something like that, just wait till the next time you're triggered in your relationship. You know,
yeah.
wait till the next time like something just happens and like you're no longer living in your present moment adult mind. You're going back to some triggered state and you're pissed off and you know, that's what we're talking about here. Triggers are elements of that world that are being set off by because something happened in present moment reality. We are not creatures of the present moment. We are creatures of memory. Fundamentally, we are creatures of memory. And we try to be creatures of the present moment. We try to, you know, we have meditation practices. We do things that allow us to sense that, like here, I'm objectively seeing present moment reality, right? Nope. Maybe to some degree you are, and maybe like the moments when you're really not triggered and you're calm and you're just, you know, perhaps those moments you're most clearly seeing present moment reality. But the more trauma that you have in your life, the more you're just living in these
Uh,
past memories.
yeah, I love that.
Uh,
Yeah, we're creatures of memory. Mm, it's
Even when we,
quotable.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so much came up. I think it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about adult trauma.
We keep putting a pin in it. Okay,
Yeah.
adult trauma. Let's go for adult trauma.
Yeah. Like I really feel that we've covered a lot of ground about early developmental complex trauma.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the same architecture as being an adult, right? It's albeit it's, you know, there's a physical, biological, neurobiological maturation process that occurs that does make it, you know, quite different when you're an adult
Yeah.
than when you're an infant, you know, so maybe a whole universe apart, but I would say there's the same underlying, you know, we're still the same species. You know, there's an underlying biological architecture and response to stress. Um, so yeah, maybe we could just start with painting a picture of somebody who had maybe they did have some of that soothing as an infant, and they get involved in a robbery. And maybe it's kind of violent, and maybe they do end up getting, you know, beaten up pretty badly and have their items stolen, there's a major violation, um, and they end up developing PTSD symptoms.
Yeah.
How would the work with this person differ from
Uh,
the work with somebody who hasn't had any adult onset trauma, but had a lot of childhood trauma, didn't really have the soothing
yeah.
to their attachment cry, maybe had a lot of criticism growing up, a lot of parent projecting a lot of things onto the child. How would that differ?
Yeah. You mean the treatment of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it would be a lot. The prognosis, the ability to access the memories, there's so many things that are different between them that make the adult trauma much easier to work with.
Hmm.
You know, again, these things don't live I was gonna say they don't live in dissociation, but okay, so the big thing is I would say, you might not even need psychedelics to work with sort of those adult single event traumas. Probably they'll be helpful, but this is material that lives much closer to the surface of somebody's consciousness. And ideally, if you can get to it, after the person's recovered and everything like that, if you can get to it before it's really solidified, calcified in their system, then
Hmm.
it's so much easier to move. It's like they didn't have to build a whole personality around this one
Yeah.
event that happened versus
Wow.
the childhood trauma, you had to build an entire personality around what was going on back there, right? So when you're processing the childhood trauma piece, not only are you processing the events that the traumatic events, but you're processing the self that got created in response to those events. From the adult one that you mentioned, Anders, you're not processing the self that got created in response. And certainly you can take an extreme thing, like you can take, I don't know, you can take people that lived in a genocide zone.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
can take
exactly.
people that live in just, those kinds of situations. Okay, then we're talking about something different. It's so prolonged, it's so affecting not just you, but your family and your entire culture. That will shift your personality, right? But I think if the two ends of the spectrum that we're talking about are, how you articulate it, sort of childhood complex trauma, and then like the single event robbery that happened, the robbery. If I had to choose between having one of those two things happen to me, I would pick the robbery every time, right? It's just the number of sessions is going to be much less in terms of like you can potentially get away, like do 3 or 4 sessions and really process everything about that robbery
Hmm.
versus childhood trauma.
Yeah, I think what the underlying variable here is personality and the way that we actually form being a person
Yeah,
in the world. And
yeah,
because and what personality is, it's not just like a self-identity. It's not just oh, this is who I am. Um, it's the fabric of the reality that you swim in. It's
hmm
the sense of others, the sense of what you can expect other people to be, expect of you,
yeah,
and the world at large, and also yourself in that world, but also just the ground of your experience. It's so foundational to how you experience the world, um, and experience in life.
yeah,
That's the work is actually going into that structure and those layers, which it sounds like with adult onset trauma, given that architecture is relatively secure, right?
yeah.
You're not going to be going towards those layers. You're going towards what got disturbed, maybe what was a charge that got stuck, or it sounds like that's the kind of work that you maybe would be focusing on.
Yeah, you're not working with personality. You're not working with the very fabric of reality when you're working with adult onset traumas. Again, with the exception of what we were talking about, if you're living in a war zone that just is unrelenting. So yeah, it's significantly easier to resolve, much less. And the other thing, of course, is we have much more solutions inherently as adults
Yeah,
than we did as children. And
right.
so typically, what is traumatizing for a child is not will not be traumatizing for an adult, very likely. And so,
Mhm.
you have much less things that go and live deeply in dissociation, but they might live in stress. They might live in panic and activation and anxiety instead of blankness.
Yeah, and I was reading a paper recently that said that our ability to structurally dissociate decreases as we age. I don't know
Oh,
how true
yeah,
that is, but
yeah,
to me, that's interesting.
yeah.
Obviously, dissociation doesn't go away, but the ability to sort of structurally dissociate, so splinter off into different kind of self states with
Yeah.
high dissociation, that starts to actually fade away with time,
Oh, okay.
unless, it happened early. Um, yeah, so that I've heard that. I don't know how true that is, but I've recently read that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it may have something to do with what we're talking about. Again, that core structure is there. Which again, but the other thing this brings up is, well, what happens when somebody that has that childhood compromise, the cracks in the foundation, when that person has an adult trauma, you know?
Yeah,
I think that's the difference between somebody who has an adult trauma and is able to recover from it and may not even need therapy for it, and somebody who has an adult trauma and it shakes them to the core, and what they find at their core is all of this other nightmare and all of this other compromise and dissociation, right? It's hard to build back up from that. So
yeah,
if you're, I don't, if you're an adult and you have a lot of childhood trauma, I would not do something like join the military. I would not
yeah,
do something
yeah,
that,
yeah.
that specifically will put you in risk of, not just having new adult traumas, but then will just shake you back down to those core traumas.
Yeah, which are a lot of, it could be pre-verbal, undifferentiated, just the ways, the intensity and the reality that we existed within when we were infants or children likely feels entirely alien to the reality that we kind of inhabit day to day. And so that core that gets shaken can be experienced and made sense of in very dangerous ways. Um, and yeah, I can see how people who have a lot of trauma early on and then have a big traumatic event can have a really hard time recovering from that, because it's
Yeah,
not just that event, it's the whole web
that's it.
of
That's it. Yeah.
traumatic material that's been dissociated off and just requires so much relational holding for that
Yeah.
place to be able to work with that.
Yeah. It's not a good setup for people. You know.
No, not a good setup. Yeah, I mean, it's making me want to, I think it's a, ample time in life right now to with the genocide going on, actively. I think to talk about that, to talk about what does trauma work look like in the trenches. And I
Mm.
don't know. I don't work in that way. That's not my specialty, and I'm not sure if that's what a PSIP wants to. I don't know if that's the direction that PSIP would be going. But yeah, but I think about that a lot, and especially doing my own work and then working with people. It's like, we're so lucky to have an environment where we can just for an hour sit down, relatively cozy, physically safe. But how would this work if that environment wasn't there? If we didn't have that environment?
Yeah.
Um,
You need it to varying degrees, I think an initial condition necessary for the processing of trauma is, relative safety. It doesn't have to be absolute, but, you have to be relatively out of the war zone, literally, right, in this case.
yeah, yeah,
And if you're not, then there's no reason for your system to begin to unwind any of this. So yeah, you know, you're absolutely right. PSIP is not designed to work with people that are still in the war zone. It's like, it works great with people that have left.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, yeah, I'm not sure
Hmm.
what to say anything beyond that, but, you know, resourcing, and maybe there's other modalities that are kind of, you know, help your secondary consciousness make meaning of things. But fundamentally, we're talking about, you know, your nervous system having all these reactions that, you know, or it should be having. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's helpful. I think that's helpful to speak on. Um, even though I don't know if there's much else to say about it, I think it's just helpful to speak on the horrors that are in the world,
Yeah.
along with the beauties that what we've been talking about, the beauties of coming into life. There's also a lot of horrors that are occurring.
Which, by the way, I'll just speak. I don't know if we touched on this last time at all, Anders, but like, I mean, the more that I sit with all of this, the more that I'm doing this work and kind of understanding what's going on, like, I feel like the real horrors that are happening in this world are a function of the world being mostly secondary consciousness. Which is to say, again, you know, like, you know, you can have like violence and horror in primary consciousness. There's rage, there's aggression, there's all sorts of animalistic impulses that live down
Mm.
there. But the fact that we can, you know, but there's also empathy, there's also sensitivity, there's also, you know, like, you know, there's kind of like a very alive recognition of life that happens there in primary consciousness versus secondary consciousness. You can be just shut off, dissociated, and you can use this awesome, powerful cognitive computer that we have and say, hey, I'm just going to get really efficient at killing people.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
know? So I think we can do horror and damage and nightmarish things in secondary consciousness in ways that we could not begin to do in primary consciousness. You know, and if you've ever heard, there's that Hannah Arendt's book on Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? Where Eichmann was so he was a Nazi, and he was on trial, and he was saying, like, you know, he was a like a bean counter. He was like an accountant, and he
hmm
basically was like, well, I can. He was on trial because he made the entire systems of killing people incredibly efficient, right?
hmm
And he wasn't like, you know, and so he was just like,
yeah,
so it was like that. That's what I mean by this, that you can shut off this inherent feedback loop of aliveness and sensitivity to life, and you can talk about genocide while eating an ice cream cone.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I really resonate with that. And it's something I don't have much to add to it, but it's just it's what I see as well. I think that there's, you know, if it is primary consciousness, you're right. There's a lot of really hot rage and intensity in it. Yeah, but there's also just the capacity, this deep capacity for, yeah, like you were saying, empathy,
Yeah.
sensitivity, care. Um, you know, I think it's the same. There's something similar with I think what a lot of saints talk about when they talk about kind of communing with nature, with nature, with God, you know, just and not in the sense of going into the cosmos, but just of understanding of yourself as just a part, a fabric of this living, breathing creation. You're a part of it. And there's something about secondary consciousness. And
You're not a
you know,
part of it.
I'm making some claims here, but it doesn't feel
Yeah.
to be so aware of its origin, aware of its, yeah, but doesn't feel part of it, doesn't feel part of
Yeah.
the breathing, living source.
No, I mean the word, it's an abstracted reality, right? Um, And insofar as we've been living in secondary consciousness, we're abstracted from, and we are, right? We're not in nature in the same way. We're pulled out of it to a certain degree. And, maybe that's not so bad, but just to be clear about something, we're not, primary consciousness is not some beatific state. It's not enlightenment. It's like a
Yeah.
varied, embodied animal existence. But in my book, that is enlightenment, I guess, which in the sense of like when you have that hot rage going on in primary consciousness, yeah, and it's so angry and all of that happens, but it's alive and it moves. It
Yeah.
evolves,
Something
it
pure about
changes
it.
into something else. Versus like if you like set like your mind to say like, okay, I want to exterminate an entire people, you can do that from a very cold, calculating place.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
not doing that from hot rage. You're doing that as like, well, what's the best strategy to do that? And then you go home and have a nice dinner with your wife,
Yeah. Oh,
Or-
yeah. God. And I love what you're saying. Yeah, because I think that's where sometimes I get a little like held up. I'm not sure. I don't want to say it's this beatific vision, this private, because there is a lot of, I mean, it can be scary, right? And it can be destructive and it can, um, but at the same time, there is I think, at least in the context when it's facilitated in this way, and when we approach it in the way that, especially it's approached in PSIP, yeah, I mean, there is something so pure about it. And I think I'm just thinking of like a lion that's chasing down a gazelle and takes a bite out of a gazelle. It's violent and it's destructive, but in a lot of ways, it's not cold.
Yes.
It's done really, it's really sincerely. It's done
Yeah.
really authentically with really purely. And the
I
way the
love
gazelle
that.
screams and it's just, it's all
Yeah.
dance is just, there's something
Yeah.
about it that has this purity to it, this
No, I
that
love that.
discourse.
I love that articulation of it, Anders. It's like it's done sincerely, right? It's like there's nothing malicious in it. There's nothing malicious in it, right? It's just like, no, I really want this. I really like want to take a bite out of you, and you're like, and it's yeah, it's not evil.
Right, right.
It's not evil. Evil comes in from a very, I think, kind of a different place in our systems.
I agree. I agree. And it's hard to, I mean, for me, it's hard to talk about, because to put words to, because it
Hmm.
is such a felt sense. But I agree. I think that real evil can and does come through in that sort of calculating secondary consciousness where our own feeling is to some degree, to whatever degree you can, numbed away.
Yeah.
And just the horrors that we can engage in without even realizing it, without even realizing we're doing anything wrong.
Yeah. I think as we're talking about this, the sense I'm getting is like, and I would agree with this, like morality, I think fundamentally exists in primary consciousness, and secondary consciousness is fundamentally amoral, meaning that
Mm.
like, like when you're in primary consciousness, you have a natural empathy for when you see suffering, you have a natural empathy for it, and nobody needs to tell you to have an empathy for it. But in secondary consciousness, you have to be told by religious traditions that you're supposed to care about this, or
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
supposed to do X, Y, and Z. I think in primary consciousness, you just do X, Y, and Z.
yeah. Mm. Yeah,
How
this
do
is a
you,
very
yeah,
interesting discussion. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah, to have to be told, yeah, I'm following, and not to say that rules are bad and they're informed by something, but there is a sort of feedback process of, how to also, how to be in relation in a society, requires secondary consciousness, requires the ability to use tools and to self-reflect. And, as I think so. I don't
no,
know.
no, I agree.
But
I
yeah,
agree.
yeah. But that can almost run. run rampant. It can run on its own feedback on its own. The tool can start feedbacking on the tool use itself, and then it just becomes, yeah, tools for tools' sake.
Yeah, you're fundamentally a tool.
A tool. Yeah.
You're fundamentally, I mean, uh, yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think the idea, at least the way that I conceive of it in PSIP, is that we're not throwing out secondary consciousness. Again, it's an awesome, awesome tool. We're just saying, let it be informed by sort of this much bigger version of you. The entire, let the tip of the iceberg be informed by the entirety of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And I think that entirety of the iceberg brings with it morality, versus if you have an entire culture that's just living in the tip of the iceberg, you can come up with the craziest things and say like, well, yeah, let's go ahead and do this now. You can, factory farming makes sense in secondary
Yeah.
consciousness. They
Yeah.
things like
Yeah, let's build virtual reality machines and hook ourselves into AI-assisted, just the ridiculousness
yeah.
of detachment from just this like living, breathing source and ground.
And I think that
Scary. Yeah.
absolutely scary. I mean, like literally, it's a tool that has nothing constraining it. It's saying like, oh, look, I can create anything because it is fundamentally amoral.
Yeah.
Where does the morality come from in secondary again, it's like my sense is we need religious traditions because secondary consciousness doesn't operate with morality in the first place. And
I really agree. And because I think they're really informed by something. Like they're really informed by prime if you want to call primary, I don't something I don't know, but something sacred. And I think the more you get into secondary consciousness, even the word sacred is like starts to lose it. It's like, what are you even talking about?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sacred
And
has no meaning in secondary consciousness. Yeah,
no meaning, no meaning. It's just it's a word. It's just an abstract
right.
word. And oh yeah, this is a potent conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's really alive right now in the world. When we have, we're at a stage right now. I'm no historian, but we're at a stage in our evolutionary history where our technology is at a point where it's never been before. It's rapidly accelerating, and we have people with billions of dollars who have no interest in the well-being of humanity and this planet, wanting to blast us off into space and build artificial worlds. It's very concerning to me. Meanwhile, there's a genocide going on. There's global tensions. It's scary. It's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think, yeah, I don't know. Part of me is thinking too. It's like, okay, well, fear is also an influencer of where we might commit some atrocities. But yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, fear moves, right? If you're engaging fear, fear's primary consciousness, and if you're engaging it as a primary consciousness experience, it moves, it flows, it shifts, it resolves. If fear is just kind of hanging out in primary consciousness and there's a lockdown because you're mostly living your life in secondary consciousness, these things, nothing moves, right? Nothing.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
All
I
these
see what you're
primary
saying.
consciousness experiences are not fluid. That's the big price to pay here, folks. That's what we're losing. Right? We stop being fluid beings and we become static, and we make decisions based on based on that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, that's really the vital point is this the staticness, the way we get stuck and then abstract from our experience, from our experiential contact. And when we do that, yeah, our contact with morality starts to become maybe an obligation. Maybe
Yeah.
I gotta give money to the poor today because that's what I do, or it's part of. Yeah, there's no experiential contact with the. I see the suffering person on the street. I would give my jacket to you. Of course I would. What? Like that's not even a question.
Yeah.
There's just this. It's because you're seeing it. You're in contact with. I would say a source that has in its fabric a moral direction to it.
Yeah.
Um, and I can't abstractly say what that is. It's just in the movement itself, there is a moral, I don't know how to describe it. It's just something about it feels, yeah, feels moral, feels connected to a source that is moral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is, I would say, ultimately like supportive of life, right?
Yeah, supportive of life. Yeah. On the side of life, on the team of life.
Yeah.
Yeah. I yeah, think this is a good place to wrap it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Oof, I'm
Yeah.
heated up. My
Yeah.
body is warm.
Yeah, that's a lot, you know? And I think the implications of what we were talking about are like, I feel like I've been thinking about this for a bit, but like I haven't been quite doing it in dialogue is really kind of supportive of like taking it further, right? Like what does this really mean? Like what are the functions of what's taking place in primary and what's taking place in secondary? And and the more I think about it, I'm like, oh yeah, I think the way that the world looks today more and more really is a function of of having more and more of a secondary existence,
Yes.
an abstracted existence.
Yeah, and I think it's like what you're saying too. I resonate with it. After my sessions, obviously there's like two tracks. There's one track of my own personal life of the changes and the developmental milestones I never reached that I'm now like, the feeling of just pure curiosity coming into my life. That's never, I realized it was a nostalgic feeling. It was like I haven't felt curious for 20 something years. And it's just this really pure curiosity coming about of just like interested in the environment and curious about things for curiosity's sake. Um, just those little individual personal openings that are just so beautiful. And I just cherish them so much on my own personal level. And then there's also this element of maybe, the part of me that's always interested in looking at things, philosophically, maybe trying to generalize a pattern out. And just like like what's happening? This is so fascinating. Like what is happening? And I can't help but want to generalize or want to make sense of things in this new with this new movement, this new understanding that's kind of developing in me.
Yeah.
And it has also just been in my own personal consciousness of like what is morality? How do I make sense of the horrors in the world with
Yeah.
this? And I feel like there's a whole new realm of like contending with certain things a little bit differently. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's also been helpful for me to have this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah. And I mean, horribly, I think one of the other outcomes of trauma is probably people tend to live more of a secondary consciousness life. They're just, they're distrustful of the nightmare. They're distrustful of the mechanisms in their mind, their system that hold memory of the nightmare, right? The nightmare emerges through primary consciousness. People don't want to go there, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that staticness you talked about really, really
Uh-huh.
does. It's like such an important feature because I could see a lot of people making arguments for it, like, well, the real violence happens when we give into our impulses,
Mm-hmm.
and we actually want to, in the age of reason, detach ourselves from our human passions and act, as true, reasonable human beings. And
Mm-hmm.
but what you're saying something fundamentally. You're not you're not saying let's like the true morality is in these impulses. It's in the staticness or the it's in the flowing, the movement of primary consciousness of what has been stuck and calcified.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in
Yeah.
that when things are stuck and calcified, they get acted out in very repeatable,
Yeah.
often often violent ways, because usually violence begets dissociation, and then we repeat maybe like sadistic, sadomasochistic, type scenarios gets repeated out in the external world. But in this way, when it's actually moving, the repetition doesn't happen. Yeah.
Yeah, it's happening where it needs to happen. It's
Yes.
happening in the direct place where it's trying to complete, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, so for me, I trust anything as long as it's happening in the container of primary consciousness. Um, rage can happen there and it'll come up as
Yes.
like
Yes.
this,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
like, anything, sexuality, all those things can happen in primary consciousness. They're not being acted out by secondary. It's like secondary is not sitting there saying like, oh, look, I feel this way. Now I have to go do X, Y, and Z in the world.
Yes. Yes. Oh, I love this. This could be a whole other conversation, and maybe it'll need to be. I think this
This
is
is
a
a long
fun
one, so you might
development.
you might need to break it up. But yeah, maybe we'll open to it. Yeah.
Okay, Saj, it was great talking to you.
Awesome.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Oh, good.